Hayat hızla akıyor ve biz bu hızı seviyoruz. Her güne heyecanla başlıyor, her anı doya doya yaşıyoruz. İlk günkü heyecanımızla yılları aşıyoruz. Zaman akarken biz de kendimizi arıyoruz. Heyecanla, merakla. Sen de kendini mi arıyorsun? O zaman zamana yetiş. Bu sadece kendini bulmakla ilgili değil. Asıl heyecan kendini yaratmakta. Bir şeyler mi yaratmak istiyorsun? Mükemmel. Metali işlemeyi, bir bina yapmayı, bir iş kurmayı, hatta bir şehir kurmayı öğren. Hayat kurtarmak, teknoloji geliştirmek, üretmek, hepsi burada. Ve burada tüm deneyimler profesyonellerle yan yana.
Haykırmak gelir. Eğerler bariyerleri kırarlar.
Asla yalnız yürümez. Ancak hızlı ilerlemeliyiz. Çünkü bugün şimdi gerçekleşiyor ve yarın çok yakın. Hayatta öne geçmek istiyorsan önce zamanın önüne geçeceksin. Hep ileri gideceksin. Bu Doktor Suat İrfan Gülserkan'ın onun da söylediği gibi üniversiteler toplumların dokuma tezgahıdır. Toplumları geliştirir, dönüştürür ve gelişmesini sağlar. O burayı bugünden yarına hazırlamak için kurdu.
Yes, good afternoon and welcome to the first event of the Global Security Seminar Series that is organized by the Near East Institute. My name is Mustafa Chirakli and I'm the director of the Institute. As some of you will know, each year the Institute organizes a range of events that are of relevance to Cyprus and the wider region. And the Global Security Seminar Series is a key part of the Institute's agenda, I suppose, which aims not only to offer and showcase cutting-edge research on the manifold aspects of security, but also to offer expertise to a range of stakeholders, not only academics, but also policymakers and NGO representatives. Today, we continue to do just that, and in pursuit of that agenda, we introduced this year's seminar series with a challenging yet equally topical discussion, and that is on the EU's engagement with Afghanistan and the EU's policy toward that country that had recently witnessed a certain turmoil. Now, I say it's challenging because the discussion invites a bit of soul-searching on the part of the European Union that had engaged with that country for just over 2 decades. And I also say topical because we know that the situation in the country remains unstable, not only because of the fact that the country is controlled by the Taliban, but also because of the deteriorating security situation and the presence of terrorist groups in that country. Today we have a distinguished guest with us who's going to be able to reflect on some of these issues. A foremost expert, Dr. HASSAN, who is a reader in national security from the University of Warwick's Department of Politics and International Relations. Now, I want to introduce our guest a little. He is the author of a study that was commissioned upon the request of the European Parliament entitled Afghanistan, Lessons Learned from 20 Years of Supporting Democracy, Development and Security. I should also add that this is the first official lessons learned study on Afghanistan published outside of the United States. And Dr. Hassan was also awarded one of the Middle East Policy Council's 2023 40 Under 40 awards, highlighting him as an important international voice on transatlantic relations with the Middle East across professionals from academia, business, culture, and diplomacy. So Dr. Oz Hassan has kindly agreed to talk to us for the next 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor. Let me rephrase that, open the floor for your questions and for discussion. So without any further ado, Dr. Oz Hassan, thank you very much and welcome to the show, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction and for the invitation. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to sort of expand upon the European report that I wrote on Afghanistan for the Parliament, and try and talk about sort of Afghanistan and where we are now. So if I could get the slides up. Can I get that done? Perfect. So why did the European Union fail in Afghanistan? I mean, these are sort of strong words, but in part, it's a reflection of honesty about exactly where we are and what the sort of 20 years has sort of led us to. So what were the sort of main findings? Well, if I was to break it down into, you know, what is quite a long, complex report and an incredibly sort of wide-ranging set of topics, I think there's three main things that stand out as the sort of causes of the failure. The first is there was a failure of knowledge and context. So if you look at what the European Union 2001, policymakers were very honest and open that one of their biggest mistakes was that they treated Afghanistan as a blank slate. That is, that they sort of said, you know, that what the European Union done is they went in with some preordained models of what development looks like, and they sort of operated on those. And what's really interesting about that is that those models were often based on Eurocentric ideas of what, you know, European development, of European modernization. And so there was no contextualization, there was no sort of historical understanding embedded in the policy itself. What's interesting about that is if you talk to the individuals, they're all very knowledgeable in large part about Afghanistan. But at the policy level, in order to sort of operate it, what you found was that the sort of expertise began to get stripped out. So there was that sort of as a sort of main issue, so that, sort of branch one, if you like, of the failure. The second sort of branch was a failure of leadership, and what the EU is now referring to as strategic autonomy. That is to say that what you found, and I think that this is what we found in throughout the 20th century, and the report does go into some of this, is that when crises emerge, there is often between European integration and transatlantic solidarity. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the end of 1979, what you found was exactly the same pattern that you discovered in 2001. That is to say that rather than having a combined European approach to Afghanistan and to the crisis, what you had was the United States pushing and member states, sorry, so the United States and member states pushing aside issues about European integration and issues around sort of having a common approach to that crisis, and instead asserting national interests that were very diverse and sort of and going alone under American leadership. So in that sense, what you've had is the European Union, certainly in 2001, but all the way through, you know, to 2016, when there was a review onwards, you had the European Union in effect saying that what we need and what we're going to do is just follow the US lead. And that ultimately has led to a set of failures, because at no point did the European Union evaluate its own strategic interests over what to do. And so that leads us to the third main sort of strand of failure. You know, why exactly did the European Union fail? And that is that there was actually a failure of imagination. And that's in part, we can tie that to the fact that there was no strategic direction. There was no sort of alternative vision. And because of those, there was actually no foresight over what could go wrong and why. And that operated all the way through to August 2001. So 2021, because in effect, what European policymakers were saying to me is that there was that the EU hasn't got an intelligence system, therefore they rely on member states' intelligence and their foresight activities and so forth what began to happen is they just assumed that the United States would stay there. They assumed that the United States would stick in for this the long term, and in many ways that the Trump and then the Biden administration wouldn't pull out as much as they did. So if you combine all of those three things, I think that, and you have those in the back of you can sort of see where these patterns have gone wrong, and why European policy failed. So moving on to the next slide quickly, if it will. There we go. So I'm currently authoring a book which is a sort of much more theoretical sort of overview of Afghanistan and the EU's relationship with it. And I sort of tend to use Booz and Little's International Systems in World History approach. And I think that that's really interesting because I think it can help us understand some of the problems that Afghanistan's gone through, in order to sort of, next time we sort of think about these things, think about how we can contextualize some of the problems within Afghanistan itself. So, it pulls out, the idea that there's pre-international systems, an interlinkage of multiple international systems, and then the development of the global international system. And with that, what I think's really interesting is that Afghanistan, if we see where it sits within international systems, back, pre-1500, back before the 16th century, is that Afghanistan is very much in the middle of a set of interconnected international systems. And so what you have is, when you start to get the rise of Europe, you get this decentering of Afghanistan within the global international system. And that kind of helps us explain some of these bigger patterns, that, there's attempts of colonialization of Afghanistan that Afghanistan's had to deal with. These weren't taken into account by the European Union's approach because it was because it adopted an ahistorical approach. You had norms over heterarchy and not hierarchy that operate, i.e., you don't in Afghanistan have sort of a state look in Europe. What you have is lots of sort of village states that operate because of the diverse geography of the terrain, come through sort of Indus civilization and so forth. You also have in sort of the medieval period all the way through till the 19th century this transition to Islam. And it's important to note that the transition to Islam was not a single event. It wasn't a sort of an invasion and then all of a sudden conversion. Actually, it took centuries for all of Afghanistan to, or the majority of Afghanistan, to begin to transform into Islam. And I think what's interesting about that is that spread of ideas and the longevity of it it shines a light on the fact that in modern sort of approaches, the US thought that it could introduce democracy within 4 years, that somehow within 4 years it could change the entire ideological structure of Afghanistan and then remove itself. Whereas actually, if we just look at the transition of Islam in the country, it took much longer. So in that sense, what we've got is norms of resistance that also developed. We've got things like dependency on external sources of revenue. We've got ideas about how Afghanistan became an independent state in the sort of 20th century. And all of these things have sort of built up to sort of create this aid dependency in Afghanistan. And that was true, certainly throughout the constitutional period. It was certainly then made even truer following the Soviet invasion, the Civil War, and the Taliban period. And then it was only after 9/11 that we sort of went into this sort of state building period that is ultimately what the EU reverted to in 2021 that failed. And hence, why did the EU fail? What's the failure? Well, we can see the failure very clearly with the return of the Taliban. And so, moving on to the next slide. So what sort of lessons then do I try and draw from, because that's quite a large historical period that I've sort of gone through. What are the sort of major lessons that we can sort of unpack and pull apart there? Well, in one sense, what the sort of main lessons from the 1980s through to 2021 were, if you look at the historical record, is that international disengagement created a security vacuum that came at a cost. Okay, so here, this during the sort of prior to the Soviet invasion, when the communist regime was after the Sahur Revolution sort of occurred, then what you had was an influx of foreign aid funding various military factions with the Mujahideen that then sort of carry on and sort of get ignored once the US and the Soviet Union withdraw and eventually the Soviet Union collapses. What Europe did at that time is it actually came in and it provided enormous amounts of humanitarian aid. It was in fact the leading humanitarian actor throughout the 1990s. So when the sort of Taliban were first sort of came to power in 1996, it was the EU that were the main actors operating with the UN, often circumventing the UN, that sort of brought the country together and mitigated the worst of the humanitarian crises that was there. So I think what that period shows us, the first Taliban period, is actually that the EU can have a mitigating effect against the worst of humanitarian crises, particularly around the issues around the human rights and the suffering of women and girls. And it can potentially create something of a development pathway, but that development pathway shouldn't be expected to lead to modernization, because the Taliban themselves are incredibly resistant to outside external pressures. So what are the main lessons that we can have from sort of 9/11 and the transatlantic strategy? Well, transatlantic solidarity and reciprocity were considered far more important, and that's crucial for many actors in the EU. The importance of Afghanistan was not success in Afghanistan. It was this idea that if we back the United States when we need help in Europe because we have another problem with Russia that looks very much like the problem we're having now with Russia and Ukraine, that actually the United States will step in. So there's this idea of reciprocity in transatlantic solidarity. But what you've got is because the EU was marginalized, you had the EU sort of returning to this sort of humanitarianism and state building. And there was a real strong tension in the way in which the US military had a sort of short-term approach to Afghanistan, whereas the EU wanted to adopt a much longer civilian long-term strategy. So in the United States, it sort of wanted to withdraw back in 2004, and ultimately sort of didn't believe that it would end up fighting a war on two fronts. It was only supposed to be a small overlap between the US being present in Afghanistan and the US being invasion of Iraq. The EU, on the other hand, has always regarded this as a long-term issue. So here what we've got is this real big mismatch between the EU that was said it was going to back the US strategy, but actually having a different sort of time horizon to the one that the US was adopting. And so what the EU failed to recognize was that there was a period of calculated neglect from the United States in Afghanistan. And so that inability to appreciate that that's what was happening has actually been one of the major failures of EU policy. Effectively, it was operating with different time horizons and different models to what the US had adopted, whilst at the same time saying that it was actually following and sort of allowing the United States to lead on these issues. So that's sort of crushed itself. So what are the main lessons for sort of bilateral relationships? So the biggest problem that the EU had was that by saying that there was a blank slate and operating as if Afghanistan was a blank slate, it failed to focus on this idea that actually Afghanistan needed to have a form of long-term peace. And so what you had from Bonn onwards through to sort of Doha agreement, when the US engages with the Taliban, is this idea that there was no way in which you can engage with the Taliban. And ultimately, the refusal to talk to various actors and to all actors, and just to effectively empower the warlords back from the Bonn Agreement, led to this idea that peace wasn't as important as development and state building. The idea was that state building somehow would make up for some sort of political process. That was fundamentally false, as we've now seen with the return of the Taliban. The other issue that the EU and other international actors failed to recognize was that because of the state building model that was being adopted, because development aid was so high, at various points exceeding 100% of Afghanistan's GDP, there was a failure to realize that actually Afghanistan simply could not absorb the high levels of international aid that were making its way into the country. And so what that led to was this corruption eruption, and a list of poor priorities built around the idea that elites should capture the aid themselves. And so what you had was, through this sort of state building model that the EU had sort of moved into, was this idea that, you know, aid funding was important in and of itself, which then sort of exceeded the level of capacity to be absorbed, which then created corruption, which then sort of led to this circular sort of complex set of problems as more and more issues arose around it. So what happened with that was that, in effect, elections were never able to legitimize a corrupt system that favored the capital in Kabul over development in the rest of the country. It also allowed for the funding and impunity of warlords themselves, who, of course, were the reason that the Taliban one of the reasons the Taliban were so successful in 1996 was because Omar was able to present himself as a sort of Robin Hood figure, fighting the Northern Alliance, fighting those warlords. And so what you had was this really complex reliance system of the US and the EU relying on the very actors that were capturing their aid, and at the same time not sort of working on the larger development of the country. And that we can see that now, because one of the explanations that was put to me by a senior diplomat was, well, you know, we can see that because the level of aid that went into Afghanistan, look at the levels of poverty now that exist around the country. Okay, so in effect, what you had all the way, that model sort of operating all the way through to 2017. You had a sort of stalemate emerging between sort of the Taliban that had made a resurgence post 2024, all the way through to 2017, and then in 2017 you've got the United States effectively saying that actually we've hit a tipping point, and we're going to start withdrawing. And what happens with that is it's that leads to the Taliban returning. So what you've got here is a set of missed opportunities, because the European Union failed to sort of appreciate the strategic reality of what was going on the ground, at the same time as failing to sort of recognize the strategic reality of where the United States was. And so there's a whole range of problems like that we can sort of discuss in questions. So what were the sort of main lessons for the return of the Taliban, which is the period we're sort of up to now? Well, the EU External Action Service was effectively taken by surprise in Afghanistan because it believed it was just too big to fail. That this idea that Afghanistan was so important, so big, they'd spent so much money in development and so much time on this, that, you know, it was the number one sort of priority post 2001, and now all of a sudden 20 years later it was just too big to fail, and so they didn't recognize what was sort of coming down the line. So the immediate cause of why the Taliban returned was obviously the US departure and sort of unilateral negotiations with the Taliban, which weakened the government of Afghanistan and actually emboldened the Taliban themselves. So there was an over-dependence on US military support and a lack of political will in Europe. Now, historically, this is a sort of key part, is that, you know, the state of Afghanistan has always relied on an external source of income for its various regimes, governments, to sort of centralized governments to effectively placate the rest of the country. You saw this with the Anglo-Afghan War, when the British withdrew funding after the sort of decolonization and so forth. You've got this sort of sense in which actually Afghanistan hasn't got an empire that it itself had in what is now Pakistan and India. And so you've got this sort of conundrum here where there is this sort of dependency that's been a historical dependency. And so it's not new. It should have been known about that this was a problem. But once you've effectively got the US withdrawing and the sort of military support, and you've got a lack of interest elsewhere, you've got the government was in real trouble. So in effect, long-term state building was a losing strategy, and it failed to tackle both the deep roots of the conflict, which and basically a need for peace. It fundamentally failed to sort of integrate Afghanistan into the region successfully. There was no sort of modern economy that was built, so you've got this over reliance on cities and so forth. And so what you've got is this real conundrum where the viability of state building as a strategy in Afghanistan is highly questionable. Now, whether that applies to other contexts, I think that the point I'm getting at right at the beginning is that you need to contextualize with the country. No two countries are the same. They have different histories and so forth. But what was ignored was that fact. But what's happening in the EU now, certainly with the policymakers I've spoken to, is that this idea of state building as a strategy is now highly, highly questionable. So next slide. There we go. So what can we sort of gather from where we are now, sort of post August 2021? Well, what we've got is the EU sort of declaring these 5 benchmarks, but I think what's really interesting, if you go through those 5 benchmarks, they're incredibly unlikely to be met. What you've also got now are new challenges that simply weren't there 20 years ago. The Taliban in the 1990s had about 30,000 fighters as an approximate. I think US intelligence sort of gathered at the time, back in the early 2000s, said that about 10 to 20,000 Al-Qaeda fighters were trained through camps there as well. But while you've got to 2021, what you've got is nearly 100,000 fighters spread out across the country. So they're a much harder force to sort of battle with now. And unlike in the 1990s, the Taliban control most of the country. So there is nothing that looks like the Northern Alliance to actually combat the Taliban now, in any meaningful sense. Now, Afghan history tells us that will change. The history of Afghanistan tells us that actually, even the Taliban will struggle because of the nature to rule over Afghanistan, because the way Afghanistan doesn't like centralized states. But what you've also got that sort of emerged now is new banking links to Russia, Iran, and Pakistan. You've increasingly got China coming in looking for these sort of geological endowments. You've got that has complicated the issue. You've got growing narcotic sales, and this one's an interesting one. Up until last year, you had growing narcotic sales. Increasingly, the production of poppies is now reducing. I've just seen a UN report in the last few days that says it's down by sort of 95%, which is common, which is in line with what you'd expect given in the 1990s with when the Taliban came in, the production of narcotics. But what you have got is this enormous illicit economy propping up the state whilst there are various sanctions on individual Taliban members and so forth. What at the same time though, because that's painting quite a grim picture of where we are, I should have of course add into that the situation we now have in Israel and Palestine, in the sense of I think that will have repercussions in the region. If you go back to the 9/11 report, one of the inspirations for various Taliban, for various Al Qaeda leaders, on record, was the situation or the treatment of Palestinians. So, will that have an effect? I imagine it will. I imagine we'll have a resurgency from Islamist groups in that country that will occur. So, on the other hand, though, given all these problems, what have we now got? Well, there are some similarities to what we've got in that, the idea right now for the EU is that they will adopt a basic needs approach, and that, the idea here is that they will use humanitarian aid, but where necessary, circumvent just humanitarianism, sort of humanitarian causes, and actually fund things like women's rights organizations and so forth. So there is a slightly political element to it. And I think that ultimately, we're in this sort of new period where the EU, I mean, it looks a lot like where we were in the 1990s in terms of the policies being adopted, but there is a different sort of organization to post Lisbon Treaty to where it was then. I think I've got enough time. That's the last slide. So what are the sort of wider sort of international objectives then? So for the EU, again, expressions of transatlantic solidarity and support in terms of European security, and we've seen that in Ukraine. NATO is better prepared today because Afghanistan to operate in Ukraine if needed and so forth. There's much sort of a greater integration within NATO. But internal EU objectives for Afghanistan, the overall objectives have ultimately failed. We have not got this functioning democratic state that was the sort of the pillar of state building exercises that the EU engaged in. We've also got progress rapidly declining in Afghanistan in terms of where Afghanistan was in July 2021 is not where Afghanistan was in August 2021, and from that point on, we have obviously got a deterioration in human rights. We've got a deterioration in particular women and girls' rights. We've got a deterioration of the use of arbitrary violence. All of these sort of things compound, and I think that there's also sort of no credible pathway to construct a sort of stable Afghan state in the short to medium term. And that has obvious implications for the European Union. There are increasing threats of terrorism. There are increasing threats of small arms proliferation. There's increasing threats of criminal narco links developing in Europe. And so all of this is adding to a high level of regional insecurity. We add to that the expulsion of Afghans from Pakistan that's occurring right now, and we've got an additional humanitarian catastrophe on our hands, in addition to various other conflicts around the world. And so what we've got with the right now is this really serious situation where the failures of EU policy are going to have ramifications for the future. So a sort of final sort of slide, because I've covered a lot of ground here. Most of this stuff is in the EU report that Mustafa mentioned right at the beginning. So the European Parliament study, which evaluates the EU policy in rather than in quite a lot of detail. It also identifies important lessons, and it sort of makes 32 recommendations based on everything from supporting democracy and peace building, all the way through to transatlantic relations and cooperation and so forth. And then in addition to that, next year, Bristol University Press will be publishing a book on this topic that really is a much more academic look at the EU's relationship with Afghanistan through history and what that's meant for today. Super.
Well, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I think you are right in the sense that we could sort of distinguish between rather institutional and political shortcomings and difficulties, if you like, but that there are also some country-specific challenges. Yes, the EU shouldn't have treated Afghanistan as a sort of a blank state. And one of the findings which you highlight in your report is this issue of centralization, that you say that there was a lack of devolution, that local authorities weren't given enough power, so that there was a lack of local legitimacy to some extent. I think that's important, but I wonder, whether that was something that the EU could get involved to do more. I wonder if you want to sort of unpack this a little and reflect on that. What could have been done more to help the country devolve powers onto to local level, if you like.
Yeah, I think so. With that, one of the things that was presented to me, and I think that European policymakers recognise now, is that the Bonn process ultimately tried to create a centralised state that Afghanistan has always struggled with. Okay, so in part, if you go back through sort of history and you look at the development of the Afghan state itself from sort of the 18th century on, the major conflict within the dynasties that have emerged has always been over exactly how much power should the center have compared to the individual sort of villages that were prepared to rise up against centralized authority. Okay, what that lends itself to is not the idea that you should centralize the state in this sort of multi-ethnic country. What it suggested, and I think that what was lost back in, was this idea that actually you could have had a more federal constitution. You didn't have to adopt the old constitutional system that ultimately had failed. I mean, and in many ways, I mean, what's really interesting about that is the idea was that they were going to try and bring or convince the king to come back and sort of add this sort of level of legitimacy, rather than looking at what other options were available. And what that suggests to me as an academic is that you had a sort of emergency epistemology built, right? You had this sort of emergency over, well, what can we do? Well, the model that we need to adopt is we need to make Afghanistan look more Western, right? And in many ways, what's really interesting about that is that has been what many Afghan rulers have tried to do throughout the 20th century. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, they too also wanted to go down the route of Afghanistan look more Western. But in return, what they had was different village states rising up and saying, we don't want that level of centralized control, that actually we want more independence and we're prepared to fight for it. That isn't a sort of 19th century phenomenon. That phenomenon dates back all the way up through down to the Indus civilization about 4,000 years ago. So there's this sort of norm that's built up for thousands of years there, where actually the individuals within those city states, within those village village states, they don't want that sort of level of centralization. So the more you try and centralize Afghanistan and make it look like a European state, the more going to. So the failure to recognize that actually the power needs to be spread on Kabul was a major mistake. The idea that you can then sort of not only centralize that state, but that you can do it using the individuals that were committing human rights violations throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, and that those are the very people that you're going to rely on, the very people that the Afghan people despised, which allowed the Taliban to come back. That again was a problem. And so you've got this sort of this mismatch of a sort of centralization model that ultimately didn't reconcile any of the problems that Afghanistan had.
The other theme that emerges from your analysis is in relation to the Americans' role in all this. And by the way, I'm getting quite a few questions from our students. They are sending them onto my WhatsApp number for some reason, but I'll try and reflect, and I'll share those with you as well. With the again, you sort of the report highlights the Americans' perhaps indecisiveness or change of heart at the 11th hour on some occasions. I think there's on one occasion, the EU is sort of, it finds itself pushed into this peacemaking role, whereas the Americans say, well, we are not going to be talking to the Taliban. And at the 11th hour, they change their minds and they say, well, actually, we are going to be talking to the Taliban. And then the EU having to sort of pick up the pieces. That's an interesting one. Do you think the Americans were the ones that sort of limited the EU's role in sort of stepping up to the plate to do more? I know it sounds like a politically loaded question.
No. I think that it's the key question, in that it wasn't just the United States that functioned that way. I mean, the United States position was that we want Europe on board because it adds legitimacy. What we don't actually expect from the Europeans is for them actually to contribute anything successful, because the overall vision was that the United States can do this alone, that the United States ultimately will solve all the problems, that European powers are ultimately incompetent, but they provide legitimacy. That was diplomatically behind the scenes. Everyone I've sort of spoken to over in the US has sort of, confirmed that, and I think the historical record confirms that. What you had at the beginning was, when Britain was taking over, for example, narcotics, you had Germany with the police force. Germany has historically, prior to sort of World War II, Germans have trained the Afghan police force. There was a hiatus during World War II, and then around the 1950s, Germans had policies of trying to train Afghan police forces again. So in fact, it was highly trained German. It was highly trained Afghans who were sort of fighting back the revolutions back in the 1970s. They were all trained. These sort of historical records. America tried it for a bit, and then sort of handed it back to the Germans back then. So, you know, we're talking 20th century, not now. What's interesting about that is that pattern then repeats itself again in 2000, in the early 2000s, because you have the European powers and member states coming in saying, we'll marginalize the EU because actually there's lots of EU members that simply can't do the stuff we want, and so on this sort of mini-lateral level with the US, we'll lend them legitimacy and we'll take it over because we want to show that we are, you know, incapable of doing these things with the United States. And then, but rather than sort of failing, if you like, what the member states do, they no longer can do those problems. They passed them onto the European Union. So Germany has trouble sort of doing police forces and gets bored. All of a sudden, you get Europol, and the EU sort of is past the buck, right? And so what's interesting is for the European Union, from the European Union's point of view, and this is why I know the sort of title of the talk is why have they failed, and they have failed. But often what you find is that those failures are structural, they're not individuals, right? Member states have passed them on the problem because they can't solve them. And then they've not provided the capacities for the European Union to actually solve the problem because of the intergovernmental nature of the union itself. And so it's kind of like, well, the expectations are very high, but the capabilities are not awarded to them. And so what you've ended up with is that becoming quite the way that things operated throughout the 2000s, and certainly up to Lisbon.
What was that the predicament that the External Action Service found itself in the sort of the trajectory of their engagement?
Well, so the External Action Service is really interesting because it did have a successful period in 2016 when you've got the Brussels conference, you've got some peace talks that sort of work out. But what's interesting about that period is not just that it's post-Lisbon, but that it's also the period in which the United States becomes less interested in Afghanistan. So all of a sudden, the EU is no longer marginalized, which means it hasn't got the US objecting to some of the things the EU wants to do. But you've also at the same time got the sort of post-Lisbon consolidations, which allow diplomatic powers and so forth. And so what's really interesting about that is that, crucially, around 2016, there was an opportunity to do more. The EU failed to do more. And one of the problems here, because this moves level, because it becomes a slightly more bureaucratic issue, is that, and I don't want to lionize the delegations, but what's incredibly interesting is the delegations themselves, and historically here, have always had more expertise than the folks over in Brussels, by the virtue of them being there, right? So they're there, they've got the expertise, sort of problems are on a day-to-day basis, they're writing the reports, they're sending them back to Brussels, and then what you get in Brussels is, quote unquote, people not reading the papers. Right? So they've not digested the papers. What you've got is this situation where they just sort of go, but development will cure all ills, because you've got this enormous sort of bureaucratic Titanic ship where it just has this sort of humanitarian strand, it has this development strand, and it has all this enormous capability of doing that. But when you're getting feedback from the delegation saying, actually, that needs to change, that this isn't going to work, that actually we need to focus, you need to focus on corruption, you need to focus on peace building, you need to focus on the very political problems that are here because the Taliban are advancing and we're going to end up in a stalemate. What you get is this solution of, well, we can turn a blind eye to that because the United States doesn't want us to engage in anything that looks like peace building, right? We with the corruption side of things, because it's not the EU that's turning up with, you know, $6 million bags of cash and distributing them from the military. So all of a sudden you've got like these set of problems, but equally, yeah, haven't got the EU saying, but how, like EU actors, you haven't got them saying, right, we know this is going on. How is this affecting our policy? How do we adapt to these circumstances? And so you've got this really complex dynamic of sort of going, what we'll do is we'll just carry on doing what we're doing. We'll carry on with the development. We'll carry on sort of we're trying to get more development aid. We'll carry on with these policies. We won't change in 2016 anything that we've been doing since 2001. Right, the overall strategy stays the same.
I know we have to be sort of cautious here, but you know, state building. Kosovo was for such a long time the sort of the go-to when people were talking about the expertise of the European Union in efforts to promote democracy, but also in efforts towards state building. And I wonder if they learned anything from that experience in which they applied successfully in Afghanistan.
The expertise is there. And like, you know, no one I spoke to, and I was given pretty much carte blanche to talk to everyone. No one I spoke to was uninformed or didn't know what they were talking about or anything like that. The problem was the model that they were adopting was wrong. And why do I say that? In that they refused to recognize that they were still in a war zone, that the Taliban had not dissolved. So there was this idea that development can just carry on at the same time as you've got the Taliban making insurgencies. And that creates this really complex set of problems in Afghanistan, right? So all of a sudden, you know, it was put to me by a senior diplomat and he gave me some very good examples. So, for example, the Danes decided that they were going to start building roads because roads are right. You can all of a sudden you move away from sort of, you know, having to put things on sort of on horses and so forth, and you can move from one place to the other. So excellent. So they built these roads with the development money, and then all of a sudden more Danish troops start to die than any other European faction sort of contribution, because of course what happens is they build the roads that the Taliban then use to attack Danish. So you've got that as a complex set of problems. So it's like, right, okay, so the development in that sense becomes dual use. Another example, humanitarian, you know, humanitarian cause, water development. How you solve that is, right, what we're going to do is we're going to start building irrigation systems. Okay, so all of a sudden you start getting people building irrigation systems in Afghanistan that are wonderful because they provide water for people, fresh water. They provide a way of reaching parts of Afghanistan you couldn't do. Or what happens when they do that is they notice there's a decline in troops getting attacked. What's the decline? Well, all of a sudden, what they've actually done is create an irrigation system to grow poppies. So in effect, rather than sort of, you know, building up a sort of development strategy that helps them, you get this increase in narcotics And then because of the increase in narcotics, you've got an external funding source for the Taliban. So in effect, your irrigation system has just fueled the very insurgency that you are fighting. And then there's so many examples of that sort of going on, where you get these development projects actually helping to help. They actually help create the sorts of insurgencies that the troops were trying to fight. So the two things didn't necessarily go hand in hand, because they didn't recognize that they were causing problems for each other. There was no complex systems thinking going on, and that lack of adaptability was a problem. And in many ways, I mean, you know, again, let's go back to the history here. So back in the 1970s, right? So when you've got the communist regime taking over before the Soviet invasion, you've got refugees fleeing over to Pakistan, right? What does Pakistan do? Pakistan goes, right, we have this Islamization agenda. We need some strategic depth against India. What we're going to do is we're going to start helping the Mujahideen. Well, what's the first thing we're going to do? We're going to build roads all the way up to the Afghan border, right? Because that's how you transport people. The people who are recruited in places like Peshawar, you recruit them there and you drive them over to the border by creating those roads. The British found that as well in the 19th century in the Anglo-Afghan wars. They could never control those areas, and so what they'd do is they'd build some infrastructure, and then they'd have to protect the damn infrastructure because that was fueling the insurgency. And so these things go on and on and on, and there's a sort of repeating set of patterns where people just have come in like these are new problems. And I think that's I think that's my key part when I'm sort of referring to the problem, and why I put the problem of ahistoricism first, is that these aren't new problems. These are the same problem in a different context that have been repeated multiple times. And so for the EU to turn around and sort of say that we are going to operate like this is a blank slate was a fundamental problem. That they operated without the prior knowledge and understanding of the country is a problem. And that's ultimately, when you sort of go through it, builds up all these problems, and that's why they failed.
We are sort of running out of time very quickly, but I'll ask this one. This is from one of our students, and it's with regards to the unfolding situation in the region with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also I think you mentioned too the pushback from Pakistan. The Afghani nationals or the refugees were given a certain deadline by which they were asked to leave the country, returning back to Afghanistan in their thousands. At the same time, I think Pakistan is also blaming the country for harboring terrorist groups. So, you know, in what ways could the unfolding situation in Palestine implicate or impact the situation in Afghanistan, and what would be should we expect another sort of flashpoint in Afghanistan? I think that's the question they were trying to pose. Okay,
it's a question because it's asking me to interlink these complex problems. But let me take so what's happening in Palestine right now is a human catastrophe of epic proportions. What we've got is a political choice by Israel to respond to a terrorist action that was horrific. We've got a response that is a political choice by Netanyahu. It's an odd situation. So if you look at the way in which the United States took out terrorists in Afghanistan after it withdrew, you had the #1 terrorist in the world, the architect of 9/11, sort of in an apartment. They were able to use a Hellfire missile and just blow up that apartment, right? There was a so what's possible is there. What Israel has chosen to do looks like a systematic form of punishment. The implications for that are that it will lead to a level of radicalization beyond the Israel-Palestine conflict. That level of radicalization will impact Afghanistan. Okay, and so and that's not. I don't think that's. I don't think that's a stretch or anything like that. I think that's a known quantity. Again, if we look at, say, for example, the 9/11 Commission report, many of the people who were the architects of 9/11, one of them didn't like the way the Palestinians were being treated. The Palestinian cause was incredibly important. So Hamas is a nationalist terrorist movement operating there, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have implications for pan-Islamism and other extremist groups, even though they would oppose each other because they operate, they're not after the same cause. So that's sort of how that will impact or how I see it impacting Afghanistan. In terms of what Pakistan is currently doing in terms of expelling refugees, Afghanistan, so Pakistan has had a long-held policy. In fact, at various points, the UN has said that back in the 1980s and 1990s, said that the Pakistani treatment of Afghan refugees was exemplary. I went through the sort of historical record on this and was quite surprised to sort of say, that you had UN actors saying that actually what Pakistan done with refugees fleeing the Soviet invasion and civil wars was, something other countries should study. So what you're getting now, though, is that with the Taliban in power, you are getting refugees being pushed back. Now, it looks it's in part, I think, because you've got radicalization that Pakistan itself has sort of promoted and supported for 40 years. In part of its policy of strategic against India, you've got that. You've also got, though, issues around small arms. So arms that have been left by NATO forces in the US and so forth have been used to attack various police forces and so forth in Pakistan. So you've got this flooding of small arms that's going on. There's a sort of transient movement there. You've also got issues around narcotics moving. But what I think the Taliban's position on this is really interesting, and it's worth sort of listening to them, because they've sort of said that one of the demands that Pakistan's making that's triggered this is actually that the Taliban regime has started to build a new canal system. It looks like what the Pakistanis are doing is also trying to add pressure over issues of water and the diverting of water and so forth. So it's a much more complex sort of system between the two things. And again, if we go back to the history, Afghanistan and Pakistan for a long time have been because of not only because of the Durand Line, but over the Pashtunistan issue. So I mean, back when Daoud was leading Afghanistan, he fell out with the Americans in the Cold War because he wanted to sort of the Pashtun areas to become either independent or to fall back into what used to be the old sort of Afghan empire. So there's a whole range of issues around that where Afghanistan and Pakistan have always had this level of tension, because Afghanistan's the oldest state there, and Pakistan just sort of emerged and created a whole range of problems with the collapse of or withdrawal of the British from India. So there's a whole range of problems there that Afghanistan and Pakistan need to sort out, and water is one of them. Refugees is another, and so you've got this really complex mix that is a part of the legacy of the British Empire that is still unfolding.
Dr. HASSAN, thank you so much for that fascinating discussion, but also sharing with us your expertise. I really enjoyed, and I definitely learned a lot about the country when I was reading your report. And I certainly look forward to reading the book when it comes out, and perhaps we can have you over in Cyprus next time when that happens, and to host you here in person. So thank you so much for joining us today, and for those of you who are watching us, thank you for tuning in. And just to let everybody know, you can stay up to date with the events that the Institute organizes through our social media. We are on the social media, so do make sure that you follow us there. So thank you to my guest once again, Dr. HASSAN, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Super. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Hayat hızla akıyor ve biz bu hızı seviyoruz. Her güne heyecanla başlıyor, her anı doya doya yaşıyoruz. İlk günkü heyecanımızla yılları aşıyoruz. Zaman akarken biz de kendimizi arıyoruz. Heyecanla, merakla. Sen de kendini mi arıyorsun? O zaman zamana yetiş. Bu sadece kendini bulmakla ilgili değil. Asıl heyecan kendini yaratmakta. Bir şeyler mi yaratmak istiyorsun? Mükemmel. Metali işlemeyi, bir bina yapmayı, bir iş kurmayı, hatta bir şehir kurmayı öğren. Hayat kurtarmak, teknoloji geliştirmek, üretmek. Hepsi burada. Ve burada tüm deneyimler profesyonellerle yan yana. Ancak hızlı ilerlemeliyiz. Çünkü bugün şimdi gerçekleşiyor ve yarın çok yakın. Hayatta öne geçmek istiyorsan önce zamanın önüne geçeceksin. Hep ileri gideceksin. Bu Doktor Suat İrfan Gülsel. Tanıyor musun? Onun da söylediği gibi. Üniversiteler toplumların dokuma tezgahıdır. Toplumları geliştirir, dönüştürür ve gelişmesini sağlar. O burayı bugünden yarına hazırlamak için kurdu. Senin için, ileriye gitmek için. Yana ya da geriye değil. Sadece ileri. Çünkü gelecek çok yakın. Hadi harekete geç. Fikirlerin ne kadar ileride olursa yarına o kadar yaklaşırsın. Yanındakileri de geleceğe taşırsın. Bu senin geleceğin, senin fırsatın şimdi. Hadi yarın yakın. Hepimizi ileriye götür.